The whole town froze the moment the Apache riders appeared on the horizon. No one knew why they had come, until they stopped in front of a poor cowboy's cabin. Just days earlier, he had rescued a wounded girl in the desert, never imagining she was the daughter of a powerful Apache chief. Now, the tribe had returned, and what they did next left the entire town speechless. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the late afternoon sun. Heat shimmered above the dry ground while the wind carried dust across the lonely trails outside the small town of Red Creek. Most men had already returned home for the evening, but Elias Turner was still riding through the valley searching for 2 missing calves that had wandered off during the storm the night before. Elias was not the kind of man people talked about often. He kept to himself, worked hard, and avoided trouble whenever possible. His small cabin sat far from town near the edge of the canyon where only coyotes and wandering horses passed at night. Some people called him quiet. Others called him strange. Elias never cared enough to ask which one they meant. His old horse suddenly slowed near a dry riverbed. Elias frowned. "Come on, Rusty," he muttered softly. But the horse refused to move. Then Elias noticed something lying beside the rocks ahead. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth left behind by travelers. Then he saw a hand move weakly through the dust. He jumped down immediately and hurried forward. A young girl lay half buried against the stones. Her breathing was shallow and her face was covered with dirt. One side of her dress had been torn badly, and blood stained the fabric around her arm. Elias knelt beside her carefully. "Hey," he said gently. "Can you hear me?" The girl opened her eyes slowly. Fear filled them instantly when she saw him. She tried to pull away but lacked the strength. "It is all right," Elias said. "You are hurt." The girl glanced toward the hills as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Around her neck hung a beaded necklace Elias recognized immediately. Apache. His expression tightened. People in Red Creek spoke about the Apache with fear more than truth. Stories of raids and violence traveled through town every winter, growing larger each time they were told. Most men would have walked away the moment they saw that necklace. Elias looked at the wounded child in front of him and felt only one thing. She needed help. He removed his canteen and lifted her head carefully so she could drink. The girl hesitated before taking a few weak sips. "What happened to you?" Elias asked. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Men attacked us." Elias scanned the empty desert around them. No horses. No riders. No bodies. Only silence. Dark clouds were beginning to gather over the mountains to the west. Another storm was coming quickly. The girl would never survive the cold night alone. Elias stood and walked back to his horse. He grabbed a blanket from his saddle before returning to her side. "You can fear me later," he said quietly. "Right now we need to move." For a moment the girl simply stared at him in confusion. Then she gave a small nod. Elias lifted her carefully onto the horse before climbing up behind her. The ride back to town felt longer than usual. Every shadow across the desert seemed to carry danger. As they approached Red Creek, people immediately noticed them. Conversations stopped. Several men standing outside the saloon narrowed their eyes. By the time Elias reached the center of town, whispers had already spread through the streets. "That girl is Apache. What is he thinking? He should leave her outside town." Sheriff Collins stepped out of the jailhouse with concern written across his face. "Elias," he said slowly, "you mind telling me what is going on?" "She is injured," Elias answered. The sheriff looked toward the frightened girl sitting silently on the horse. "You know folks around here are not going to like this." Elias met his gaze calmly. "I did not ask what they liked." Without waiting for another word, he guided the horse down the road toward his cabin while the entire town watched in silence. And somewhere far beyond the darkening hills, riders were already searching for the missing daughter of an Apache chief. Rain fell through most of the night. By morning the dirt roads of Red Creek had turned thick with mud, and the cold wind carried the smell of wet earth through town. Inside the saloon, men gathered around the stove speaking in low, uneasy voices. News about the Apache girl had spread faster than the storm itself. Most people blamed Elias Turner for bringing danger to their doorstep. Walter Briggs sat near the center of the room listening carefully. He owned the largest ranch in the valley and had influence over nearly everyone in town. Tall and broad-shouldered, Briggs carried himself like a man used to getting his way. "That cowboy lost his senses," Briggs said sharply. "You bring one Apache into town and 10 more follow behind." Several men nodded in agreement. One ranch hand lowered his voice. "Maybe the girl is just a child." Briggs slammed his cup against the table. "A child grows into an enemy." The room fell silent. Across town, Elias sat near the fireplace inside his cabin while the girl rested beneath a blanket on the bed nearby. Her fever had finally started to ease, though her arms still caused pain whenever she moved. She watched Elias carefully as he prepared coffee over the fire. "You have not asked my name," she said quietly. Elias handed her a cup of warm water. "You seemed tired enough already." The girl studied him for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Ayanna." "I am Elias." She nodded slowly. For a while only the sound of rain filled the cabin. Finally Ayanna looked toward him again. "Why did you help me?" Elias leaned back in his chair. "Because you needed it. No one else would. That does not make it right." Ayanna lowered her eyes as though she did not know how to answer that. Later that afternoon, loud horse hooves approached the cabin. Elias stepped outside and immediately saw Walter Briggs riding toward him with 4 armed men close behind. None of them looked friendly. Briggs stopped near the gate and glanced toward the cabin. "She's still inside." Elias crossed his arms calmly. "That depends who is asking." "You know exactly who is asking." Briggs climbed down from his horse. "You are putting this whole town at risk." "She is injured. She is Apache." Elias said nothing. Briggs stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "You think her people will thank you for this?" "Men like them only understand fear." Elias stared directly at him. "Maybe men like you are the reason they do." The ranch owner's face hardened instantly. Behind the cabin window, Ayanna watched silently. Briggs noticed her shadow and pointed toward the house. "You hand her over now before trouble comes to this valley." Elias rested one hand near his holster. "No." The air suddenly felt heavy. One of Briggs's men slowly reached toward his rifle. Before anything could happen, another rider appeared on the road. "Sheriff Collins." "That is enough," the sheriff called firmly as he approached. Briggs took a long, angry breath before stepping back. "You are making a mistake, Elias." Without another word, he climbed onto his horse and rode away with the others. But the look in his eyes lingered long after the dust settled. That evening, the storm finally passed. Ayanna sat outside beside Elias, watching the sunset spread across the valley. The desert looked peaceful again, though both of them knew peace would not last. "My father will come for me," Ayanna said quietly. Elias nodded. "Then I suppose I should be ready to meet him." Ayanna looked toward the distant hills. "You do not understand," she whispered. "My father is Chief Nantan." Even Elias had heard that name before. And suddenly the quiet valley around them no longer felt safe at all. The sun disappeared behind the mountains long before the fear left Red Creek. By nightfall, nearly every window in town was glowing with lantern light. Men stood outside the saloon carrying rifles while mothers hurried children indoors. No music played that evening. No laughter drifted through the streets. Only silence. The name Chief Nantan carried weight across the frontier. Stories about him traveled from ranch to ranch for years. Some called him dangerous. Others claimed he fought only when pushed into war. But nobody in Red Creek truly knew the man behind the stories. They only feared what they imagined. Elias sat outside his cabin sharpening a knife while Ayanna watched the dark hills carefully. "You should not stay here," she said softly. "And where exactly would you like me to go?" She almost smiled at that. But before she could answer, Rusty suddenly lifted his head and snorted nervously. Elias stood at once. Then he heard it. Horse hooves. Many of them. Ayanna rose to her feet immediately. Her eyes fixed on the distant ridge above town where shadows were beginning to move beneath the moonlight. "They found me." Within minutes the sound spread across the valley. People rushed into the streets. Sheriff Collins climbed onto the porch outside the jailhouse while armed men gathered beside him. Walter Briggs stood near the center of town, gripping a rifle with clear excitement burning in his eyes. "I warned all of you," Briggs shouted. "Now they are here." Dozens of riders appeared across the hills overlooking Red Creek. They sat silently beneath the moonlight, their horses barely moving. At the center rode a tall figure with silver-braided hair and a dark feather hanging beside his shoulder. Chief Nantan. The town froze. No one fired. No one moved. The chief slowly guided his horse forward until he reached the edge of town. His expression remained calm, though his eyes studied everything around him carefully. Sheriff Collins stepped forward with visible tension. "What do you want?" the sheriff asked. Chief Nantan spoke in a deep, steady voice. "My daughter." Before another word could be said, Elias rode into town beside Ayanna. Gasps spread through the crowd immediately. The girl climbed down from the horse and ran straight toward the Apache riders. Chief Nantan dismounted quickly and caught her in his arms. For the first time that night, the feared warrior looked only like a father relieved to see his child alive. Ayanna spoke rapidly in Apache while pointing back toward Elias. The chief turned slowly toward the cowboy. Every hand in town moved closer to a weapon. Chief Nantan walked forward until he stood face to face with Elias in the middle of the dusty street. "You protected her?" the chief asked. "I did." "Why?" Elias shrugged slightly. "She needed help." The chief studied him for several long moments. The entire town held its breath. Then, to everyone's shock, Chief Nantan lowered his head slightly in respect. Murmurs spread instantly through the crowd. Walter Briggs looked furious. "This proves nothing," Briggs snapped as he stepped forward with his rifle. "They are here to attack." Ayanna pointed directly at him. "No," she said loudly. "His men attacked us in the canyon." The street fell silent again. Briggs's face tightened. "You lying little savage," he growled. Several Apache warriors instantly raised their rifles. At the same moment, Briggs's men reached for their weapons. Elias stepped between both sides before anyone could fire. "Stop right now," he shouted. Tension filled the air like smoke. Chief Nantan lifted one hand, signaling his warriors to hold their fire. Then he looked directly at Briggs. "3 of my people were murdered," the chief said coldly. "We followed the tracks to this town." Sheriff Collins slowly turned toward Briggs. "You got something you want to explain?" For the first time in years, Walter Briggs looked nervous. And everyone in Red Creek could see it. The silence in Red Creek did not last long. Walter Briggs tried to step back into control, but the street was no longer his to command. Apache riders held their ground at the edge of town, steady and watchful. Townspeople stood frozen between fear and confusion, unsure which direction would bring safety. Sheriff Collins kept his hand near his holster, his eyes fixed on Briggs. "You heard what the chief said," the sheriff spoke. 3 dead men and tracks leading here." Briggs forced a short laugh. "You going to take his word over mine now?" Ayanna stepped forward from beside her father. "I saw them," she said clearly. "Your men wore the silver-marked rifles. The same mark I saw when they attacked us." A few townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks. They had seen those rifles before too. Briggs supplied most of the weapons in the valley. Elias stood quietly, watching Briggs carefully. The rancher's calm was breaking apart. "That girl is confused," Briggs said sharply. "She is turning you all against me." But one of his own men, a younger rider standing slightly behind him, shifted uncomfortably. The man looked down before speaking. "It was him," he said under his breath. Briggs turned quickly. "What did you say?" The man swallowed hard. "He told us to scare them off the canyon route. Said it would protect the ranch lines. We did not know people would die." The words landed heavily across the street. Ayanna closed her eyes for a moment. Chief Nantan did not move, but his expression hardened. Sheriff Collins stepped forward. "That true, Briggs?" Briggs's face twisted. "They are enemies on our land," he shouted. "You think I should just sit and watch while they move in closer every year?" Elias took one step forward. "So you hired men to attack travelers and call it protection?" Briggs suddenly reached for his revolver. Everything happened at once. Elias moved faster. He struck Briggs's wrist, sending the gun spinning into the dirt. Before Briggs could react again, 2 Apache warriors dismounted and restrained him. The crowd erupted in noise. Some men backed away. Others raised their weapons but hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to start a war in the middle of town. Sheriff Collins finally stepped in and forced Briggs to his knees. "You are under arrest," he said firmly. Briggs struggled, but it was over. His influence, his control, everything he built in Red Creek had collapsed in moments. Chief Nantan looked down at him with cold disappointment. "You brought death into my land and into yours," the chief said quietly. "For what? Land that was never yours to begin with." Briggs did not answer. Instead he stared at Elias with burning hatred. "This is your fault," he muttered. Elias did not react. Because in that moment, the truth had already spoken louder than any anger. Sheriff Collins ordered Briggs taken away. As the men led him toward the jailhouse, the tension in the town slowly began to loosen. It was not peace yet, but it was no longer on the edge of violence. Chief Nantan turned toward Elias. "You stood between fire and people who did not understand it," he said. Elias gave a small nod. "I just did not want anyone else getting hurt." A long pause followed. Then Chief Nantan spoke again. "You will come with us to the canyon tomorrow. Not as a guest. As family." The words caused a stir among the townspeople. No outsider from Red Creek had ever been invited into Apache lands like that. Elias did not respond immediately. He only looked toward Ayanna, who gave him a quiet, approving nod. And for the first time since this began, the valley felt like it might not tear itself apart. Morning light spread across Red Creek with a quiet that felt unfamiliar. Walter Briggs was gone, taken in chains under guard to face trial. The man who once controlled the valley now had nothing but silence behind him. His men had either fled or surrendered, and the fear that once held the town together had begun to break apart. People gathered near the main street outside the church, speaking in low voices. No one sounded certain anymore. What had seemed simple days ago now felt different. Sheriff Collins stood on the steps, looking over the crowd. "For years," he said, "we believed the loudest voices without asking the right questions. That ends here." No one argued. Then the sound of horses came again. This time, there was no panic. Chief Nantan entered Red Creek with his riders, moving slowly through the street. Ayanna rode beside him, watching the town that had once feared her. The chief stopped in front of Elias. He reached down and removed a carved piece of wood from his belt, placing it into Elias's hands. "This is given only to those who choose truth over fear," he said. Elias looked down, unsure what to say. "I am not used to this," he admitted. Chief Nantan gave a faint nod. "Then you are the right man to carry it." Ayanna smiled softly from her horse. Around them, the town remained quiet. Not from fear this time, but from understanding they were still learning. And for the first time, Red Creek did not feel divided. The story of Red Creek did not end in a single moment. It changed slowly, in the way people spoke to each other, in the way doors were left open a little longer, and in the way old fears were no longer spoken as certainty. Elias stayed in the valley, though he was never quite the same man who first found Ayanna in the desert. Some called him brave. Others simply called him honest. He never accepted either name for long. Chief Nantan returned to his lands, but visits between the canyon and Red Creek became common over time. What once felt like distance slowly turned into a fragile understanding. And Ayanna often rode between both worlds, carrying messages that were not just words, but reminders that people could still choose differently. Red Creek never forgot the day everything nearly fell apart. More importantly, it never forgot the moment it did not. Because sometimes, one decision in a quiet desert can echo far beyond what any town expects. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more emotional Western stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have helped Ayanna if you were in Elias's place, knowing it could turn the whole town against you?